Hidden Hand, Exposing How the Chinese Communist Party is Changing the World. It's a new book that claims to, quote, expose the Chinese Communist Party's global program of subversion and threat it poses to democracy. Through China's enormous economic power and covert influence operations, the book argues China is aggressively targeting individual corporations and threatening freedom of expression from the arts to academia.
Clive Hamilton, professor of public ethics at Charles Sturt University, and Dr. Mareike Ohlberg, senior fellow in the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund, join us now to discuss their book. Great to have you both.
Cheers, good to be here.
Morning.
Good to see you.
Absolutely. Dr. Ohlberg, let me start with you. Just what made you want to write this book?
I basically wrote my PhD dissertation on the Chinese Communist Party's external propaganda apparatus. And at the time that I did this, I felt like a lot of the messages that the CCP was trying to send, they weren't really getting across. But then a couple of years later, I really started to pick up a lot of the talking points that the party wanted to send in more, I guess, mainstream discourse in various Western countries, both in the United States, but also over here in Europe, where I'm based. And the discrepancy really struck me. And I really wanted to explore that topic further.
Mm-hmm. And Clive, could you go into one area in particular that I saw, which was cited in Axios, was about influence operations here in the United States, namely former President George W. Bush's brother, Neil Bush. Could you detail how exactly he's being influenced by the Chinese regime?
Yes, well, Neil Bush was targeted by an organisation known as the CPAFFC, the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries, which has been very active in the United States, mainly at the kind of subnational level, targeting state governors, sister city relationships, and that kind of thing. But Neil Bush seemed to be a prominent target. He has business connections in China and Hong Kong, and he somehow seemed to take on CCP messaging. And of course, the money started to flow into a think tank that he was associated with. And the think tank started to push out pro-Beijing messaging. And Neil Bush himself would go to China or Hong Kong for CCP-sponsored conferences and really mouth the talking points of the CCP. And it's a kind of classic story of elite capture. And we detail many instances of that throughout the book.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Clive, could you give us kind of a bird's eye view of how that influence works? How does it operate, and what is the ultimate strategy?
Well, what the CCP does is it puts into place a very sophisticated and often very subtle process of psychological manipulation. I mean, I think it's accurate to describe it as grooming. And they identify and target key members of elites, political, business, academic elites, as people who might be induced one way or another to be drawn into the circle of CCP influence. And so they're very much focused on individuals. It's a very clever and subtle process. And so we track how this happens. Certain individuals, such as very prominent academics like Jeffrey Sachs, like former political leaders, like former Prime Minister Paul Keating here in Australia, who somehow get drawn into this CCP view of the world and get rewarded for it through sinecures, through flattery, through meetings with Xi Jinping, and so on.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Ohlberg, could you detail some more of that? I mean, I think what I want everybody to take away is I talk a lot here about, Chinese influence here in the United States, can point to myriad different politicians, ambassadors even like Max Baucus, straight up working for either the Chinese government or Chinese connected enterprises and touting the CCP line. How is it that they've been able to do this, not just here in the U.S., Europe, Australia, and all over? Is it just money? I mean, are so many of these people, are they willful participants in propaganda? Or is it that they just find themselves caught up in a mechanism where their entire financial livelihood will disappear if they start telling the truth?
I think money obviously plays an important role. For oftentimes it's very profitable for people to do this. But I think another really important factor in why this has been working so well is that it has been completely normalized, and that is in part due because we simply do not fully understand what the Chinese Communist Party actually wants. So in a way, for a number of years, these kinds of ties and this kind of activity has been portrayed as absolutely benign, as being a net plus, as, you know, having absolutely no harm and only bringing positive exchange with China. So it's really been normalized. So even people really didn't have to think twice before doing it. And for the longest time, none of this was challenged. And this is something that I've seen not only in the United States, but also in the United Kingdom, where this is currently being discussed very heatedly, that it's simply been normalized and nobody would even challenge the concept of these kinds of ties. And that in a really large part has to do with the fact that we never consider that the Chinese Communist Party too also has agency. It's not just what we want to do with China. There's also another side to it that has its own plans and its own agency, and that has simply been completely ignored by everyone in this debate.
Mm-hmm. And Clive, what would you say to people who say, this is relatively benign? You know, foreign countries do this all the time. They try to influence political discussion around the world. What's really the harm here?
Well, yes, of course, countries, particularly big countries, do try to have influence in other nations, but there's a difference between influence and interference, and there's a nice definition of it here in Australia, where we're kind of 3 years down the track to most other countries in understanding this. And we define, even in our new law against foreign interference as influence that's covert, coercive, or corrupt. And so the thing about CCP's influence, and we're not talking about China here or Chinese people, stress that, we're talking about the Chinese Communist Party, is that it's secretive, it's coercive, and it goes on behind the scenes. So it's hidden the way it works. And this is why when we, Mareike and I, for example, in our book, call people out, they become very upset because suddenly the CCP agents who've been operating undercover, as it were, that is, agents of influence, have their cover blown. And so in the United Kingdom, for example, two of those people have sent legally threatening letters, claimed that we've defamed them because, you know, we're telling lies. But in fact, what we're doing is just lifting the cover off, shining light on the CCP's activities. And the one thing the CCP loves to do, that is operate in the shadows, which is the wonder of a democracy with a free press, that we can actually put the spotlight on them.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you both so much for joining us and spotlighting these issues about corruption, you know, all over the West and the Chinese Communist Party. So we really appreciate your work. Thank you.
Thank you both, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
We'll have more Rising for you after this.